Hello, everyone. It might seem out of step to be talking about printed facsimiles at an event dedicated to the digital medieval manuscript. But I want to use this opportunity to highlight the fact that in terms of facsimile reproduction, digital has not, or not yet anyway, made print entirely redundant. That might seem surprising, possibly incredulous, since our collective experience as manuscript scholars is that digital images are more convenient, accessible, flexible, accurate, and generally just sharper and better in every way. But my contention is that in this world of digital plenty, the old-fashioned printed facsimile still has value for both teaching and research. And over the next few minutes, I'll outline some of the ways in which I still find the printed facsimile invaluable. To start with teaching, first of all, over the last few weeks, as we started our teaching semester in St Andrews, I've been noticing where and how and why I make use of printed facsimiles in my teaching. The basic reason that we rely on facsimiles of whatever kind, digital or print, is to fill gaps because we don't have convenient access to the original item itself. Because St Andrews is an ancient university, our library holdings have great historical depth. So in the paleography classes that I teach with Rachel Hart, we can almost always find original manuscripts to use. But one period that our holdings don't cover well is the pre-1100 era. We don't have our own examples of insular or early English vernacular hands. So my classes on early English paleography rely on the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Exeter book. And when I want to talk about insular hands, I'll use the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells. Those are, of course, some of the most famous manuscripts that exist. If we imagine a top 10 of Western manuscripts, many of those would be in it. And there are other occasions when I might want to focus on a particular manuscript that doesn't belong to us, but which is of exceptional importance in its own area. For example, Corpus Christi College, Cambridge Manuscript 61, an early 15th century deluxe copy of Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade. For all of the manuscripts I've mentioned so far, there are now freely accessible digital surrogates available online. And of course, those are resources that I use. I have links to those surrogates embedded in my PowerPoints, and I encourage students to explore them in their own time. I screenshot the particular sections that I want to focus on, because trying to access a digital surrogate live in class can be a bit of a hostage to fortune. You'll sometimes find that the website's down or that it takes too long to load. And even if there's no problem with access, there's the issue of finding the particular folio that you want. Not always that easy, because thumbnail images are often not labeled very clearly. Navigating the physical facsimile is usually more immediate and intuitive. So for a variety of reasons connected with ensuring the robustness of my teaching, I still call up items from our stock of printed facsimiles. But mostly I use them for the one thing that the digital surrogate doesn't convey very well. I use them for size. If I hold up a printed facsimile or put it on the table and pass it around the class, everyone immediately grasps a sense of how large or small the original item is. In this respect, the digital image is reductive. It makes everything the same size and shape, which is the imaginary page of a Word document, itself linked to the physical size of A4 paper. This is the size and shape that is subtly channeled through screen images of medieval manuscripts, so that we're rather tricked into assuming that one size fits all. And it really doesn't. Having a physical object in the classroom, even if it's not always the original object, just makes it easier for everyone to get a sense of that object's size and shape. In codicological terms, the printed facsimile is still the most useful aid that achieves that. That sense of size that you get from the printed facsimile is also important for paleography in terms of the actual size of the handwriting. We're all now very used to zooming into the minutiae of particular letter strokes through digital images. So it can be a real shock to be confronted with the original manuscript and to realize that script is sometimes extremely small. It's a mistake to give the impression that in-person encounters with medieval manuscripts will be like viewing those materials online. Part of what Rachel and I do in our classes, as well as teaching students how to read medieval handwriting, is to train them for consulting original materials. And the different nature of those encounters with the real is something that we foreground, mostly through our original holdings. But it can also be achieved by printed facsimiles. Overall then, I use printed facsimiles to remind everyone, including myself, that medieval manuscripts are physical, material objects. And more than that they're books. They're books that were designed for reading and for reading in person. Printed facsimiles can more instantly convey a sense of the size and shape of the material book. And they can also speed up our grasp of the relation of one part of the book to another. That's certainly a useful element in teaching, but it's of absolutely crucial importance to the researcher. And in this second part of the talk, I'll offer some examples of that from my own recent research. A lot of my research involves the study of manuscripts, and I can't always do that work without the particular kind of access that the printed facsimile offers. A few years ago, I did some collaborative work with Tony Edwards on the Auchinleck manuscript, one of the most famous 14th century English manuscripts and a major source for English medieval romances. There are some fragments of that manuscript in St Andrews, which I worked on, and there's another fragment in London, which he looked at. And I was very privileged to be given access to the main part of the manuscript at the National Library of Scotland. That direct access to the original was, of course, invaluable. But for the larger part of our investigations, both Tony and I relied on the 1973 printed facsimile, despite the fact that the Auchinleck manuscript website, hosted by the NLS, provides access to digital images of the whole codex. We were doing very detailed work on the volume's collation and on the various losses and disruptions that it suffered during its history. And it's just not possible to keep a sense of the whole object in your head whilst clicking on different links and opening up thumbnails one by one. That inability to conceptualize the whole from a digital resource has also led me to make my own mock-ups where a printed facsimile isn't available. In our research on the early modern Scottish notary, Robert Ewan, Rachel Hart and I are looking closely at a manuscript of the legal text Regiam Majestatem that Ewan copied in 1548. To understand the way that this paper manuscript was assembled, to locate its watermarks, and to get a sense of Ewan's habits of layout and presentation, including his use of different grades of script and telltale markers, I quickly realized that I needed to create my own surrogate. So I made my own rough mock-up using a series of notebooks to sketch out where certain features occurred. And from this, I'll be able to generate conclusions and observations about the physical nature of this manuscript that will be more than just impressionistic. In this case, St Andrews owns the original 16th century manuscript that we're working on. And that's also the case with my next example, the 15th century Roll of Kings. So you might think that I'd have no need for the kind of intermediary homemade version of the printed facsimile that I'm talking about here, since I can just go to see the original whenever I want. Well, yes and no. I've certainly seen the Roll of Kings many times, and it's an object that I know very well. But when you get down to the business of writing a complex piece of scholarly research, you repeatedly find that there are tiny aspects that you want to check again. And unfortunately, at precisely the point that I needed to do those checks in order to meet a publication deadline, I couldn't get my hands on the original because it was the summer of 2020 and our special collections reading room was closed due to the pandemic. I needed to get the layout of the roll straight in my head so that I could compare it with other examples to see if there was evidence of standardized or centralized production. The roll is a particular form of the medieval book that really doesn't come across well through digital surrogacy. So I ended up making myself this very basic template that you see on the right-hand side. And I know I'm not alone in making this recourse to paper and scissors and sellotape, because I've heard Elaine Trahan talking about doing exactly this kind of thing when trying to understand the precise nature of the codex. And I've seen Kate Rudy's DIY facsimile of the Egerton Book of Hours that takes a roll format. These are some of the ways in which material reproductions of the original are still more useful than a digital recreation. My last examples have focused on instances where no printed facsimile was available, and that's actually the case for the vast majority of medieval manuscripts. But some very important manuscripts have actually been subject to serial forms of facsimile reproduction. For example, the Ellesmere manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, now housed at the Huntington Library in California, has very recently been made available in a full and freely accessible digital facsimile from the Huntington's website. In the 1990s, the Huntington joined forces with the Japanese publisher Yushodo to produce a spectacular facsimile reproduction of the manuscript, which was limited to 250 copies and issued in 3 formats, the third of which was a version that presented the quires folded but unbound in a box, which facilitates all kinds of viewings by students and scholars. And this is the version you see me using here in our reading room in St Andrews. But also in this picture, on the book cushion, is the previous facsimile of the Ellesmere manuscript, published in 1911 by Manchester University Press. It's very instructive to compare the 1911 and the 1995 facsimiles, because it's immediately apparent that the objective of the early 20th century reproduction was to present a very beautiful object, as free from imperfections as possible. Made by photolithography, multiple exposures of each leaf were taken and superimposed, creating beautified pages. The result is, of course, a falsification with signs of dirt and wear erased, and with some details of decoration touched up or improved. Knowing this is important because the 1911 printed facsimile was the means of access to the manuscript that the majority of 20th century Chaucerians relied on. So much past scholarship about this manuscript, and in particular about its famous pilgrim images, was actually not based on a true foundation. Lining up older style printed facsimiles alongside digital surrogates, and ideally having the original manuscript to hand as well, gives us a fully rounded picture, not just of what that original item is like, but of how scholars have viewed that object and understood it and represented it in their writing, and thus influenced the perceptions of others. In other words, printed facsimiles are an important factor in the reception of medieval manuscripts, and their role shouldn't be overlooked. Their purpose might seem to be threatened by the advent of the digital facsimile, but it's a mistake to think that the digital surrogate has made the printed facsimile redundant. The printed facsimile has its own advantages, as I hope I've outlined here, and it's also a more sustainable resource. On this, I'll give the last word to Daniel Woodward, writing of the making of the new Ellesmere facsimile in 1995. He said, "It may be pertinent to explain briefly why the publishers have chosen to make a hard copy facsimile rather than a CD-ROM of the Ellesmere Chaucer. All versions of the facsimile have this advantage over a CD-ROM format. The Ellesmere Chaucer is a codex, not a text on a computer screen. It exploits ingeniously the format of a book and thus supplements the meaning of the text alone. Although the publishers are aware of certain advantages of a CD-ROM for textual studies, they believe that this facsimile in book form will make it much easier for readers to understand and appreciate this magnificent manuscript." Thank goodness they made the facsimile and not a CD-ROM. Thank you for listening.